Hello and welcome to another episode of Slam. I'm Adrian Paul and I've got Richard Gainey here, and we're going to be talking about swords, lasers, and movies again because it goes across the entire gamut of things today. We have so many different visual martial art movies that have changed from the old way of shooting them to the new way with all the visual effects, etc. And so with the laser swords, or light sabers as some people like to call them, we decided to sort of break some of that down because we're also starting the VVVI program, which actually has a lot of martial techniques within a fantasy world that we're creating. So, Richard, how have you been doing this week?
Doing good. Yeah, busy. Doing well.
Good. And
looking forward to getting some shooting done.
Yes, you've been working hard at getting some of those videos together that we've been editing for the VVVI program, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So this week on Slam, we're going to talk about growth, personal growth. It basically breaks down in the encyclopedia as to being personal development, which includes activities such as awareness and identity, which is what we're going to start with this week. How you develop talents, how you increase your potential, build human capital, increase your employability, enhance your quality of life, and contribute to the realization of your dreams and aspirations. So it actually encompasses a lot of thing growth, but where does it come from? We're going to be talking now about the way some people have natural talent and some people have talent they have to work for, as well as all the little pieces in between. So Richard, what do you have for us this week regarding the thing of growth? I mean, you've dealt with growth in martial arts, so how do you see that?
Yeah, so what's interesting is you and I were talking about how much there actually is to unpack when you start talking about growth and personal development on several different tiers. And just like in the curriculum, just like in the VVVI curriculum, we have that mind, body, spirit kind of triad there, that triangle. Dealing with growth, whether that is external skills, physical skills, or mental, emotional, it still kind of follows that same hierarchy and falls into one of those categories. Physical skills are typically pretty easy, in my opinion, to determine where people are at when they come into a martial arts school. Of course, everybody's got four left feet and two left arms, and they can't see, can't hear, that kind of thing. But pretty quickly you can tell where the cream falls. You get some people that progress very quickly. It almost seems like they have an innate ability to pick things up and to do them. And then you have other people that you go home at night and you just cry because you don't know how you're going to help this person grow, help this person progress.
So let's start with what does growth do to somebody, and then we'll get into the different stages. We're going to talk about awareness and identity to start with. And yes, I changed my screen, everybody. It's nice. Growth has things to do with the eco, so I decided to go green this week. But anyway, exterior situations. Let's talk about that, because a lot of the time, the awareness portion of this, you need to be aware when you're in a fight, when you're going out into the world, to be aware of the world around you, the people around you, so that it keeps you safe and gets you in the right direction for the things that you really want to achieve in your life. So, Richard.
Yeah, that you talked about physical, you talked about safety and threats and things like that, and what I found is that law enforcement is a perfect example, and I love my brothers in blue and sisters in blue, but there's a little bit of a Dunning-Krueger thing kind of going on there, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But they'll go and they'll do like a 40-hour defensive tactics thing, and then suddenly they're an expert because they have a badge and a gun, and now they're hand-to-hand combat experts, until the first time that it's 2 o'clock in the morning and they're on the side of the road with somebody and they're getting the stuffing beat out of them. And then all of a sudden there's an epiphany that, hey, I have no earthly idea and I am woefully out of my depth.
It's interesting. I was just watching a video the other day regarding somebody. It's actually a martial art teacher I'm actually going to be partnering with in Phoenix on the sword experience coming up, and he spoke about the reality versus the training. When you're in training, there's a lot of moves that you do. Your mind and your brain change when it's put under stress. So immediately, even if you're a martial art master, the immediate thing, most of the time when you're training, you're not put under that stress.
No.
And that's exactly what you're talking about. You're not given that moment of this stuff coming at you and you having to be calm, is what we talked about last week, be in that zone to be able to handle that. Most of the time, 99% of the time, if you haven't experienced it, you will revert to what you originally knew.
Isn't that one of the biggest challenges that we deal with, though, Adrian? Is bringing the students, bringing the people that participate in the programs and come and train with you and come and they participate in classes, bringing them to as high a state of realism as possible without necessarily cutting their heads off.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the Dunning-Krueger effect. Can you explain that? But let's bring up a chart here about this. Well, you have.
Yeah. So Dunning-Krueger is something that a lot of people, I think, when we see it, we get it. But it's the more you find people that really don't know anything about a topic, but they're constantly talking like they're experts in it. And then you find people like Richard Feynman, who was a theoretical physicist he's tier 1 physicist. And he was, and it was very clear from listening to him talk that, he was always learning. He was always growing. So the idea is the more you know about something, the more that you realize that you don't know, what you don't know. And the less you know about something, the more you actually think that you know.
That's so true. It's like driving a car, isn't it?
Right? It's exactly like driving a car, actually. Yeah. If you think back, what was the first thing that you did? You went and got this book down at the DMV on depending on what state you grew up in, and it's got all the rules of the road, what to do, what not to do, and you study that so that you can go in and eventually you'll get your driver's permit, and you sit you in a car and you go through, check you off, hey, you're doing this, you're doing that. And suddenly you get this little plastic card that goes in your wallet, and suddenly you're 16 years old and you're Mario Andretti. You know everything about driving, and then what happens? You come home and the car ran over a freaking pothole, tore the freaking front end out. Mom and dad are freaking out. And you get a little bit humbled. You realize, hey, I really don't know that much. So as you grow, as you progress, you and I have been driving for a while. You pick up skills and you start learning, hey, watch out for these kind of people. Watch out for those kind of people. And here we go with the Dunning-Krueger thing. You go to your first.
Isn't that the same thing as when it's wet driving? You've got a lot of wet driving. You're not used to that type of condition. It's a totally different condition. You go through wet driving, you go through snow-driven areas, right?
Yeah. The guy's swinging my sword at my head, and that's all I ever practice. And then suddenly he stabs at me, and I'm like, "Oh crap! We hadn't talked about stabbing." It's always the unexpected things that you haven't experienced before, or what kind of helps you realize that you need growth, that there's areas that you need to improve on.
Now you talked a minute ago about the police. It's interesting since you come from that background. Don't they go through a course? And you talked about them going through certain things that they do, and then finally they know about it. Is that the same type of thing?
It's no different. It's basically, they call it EVOC training, emergency vehicle operations classes. Take everything that you think that you know about driving and just go ahead and throw it out the window, because now you're doing a 90-degree turn at 30 miles an hour. You're not allowed to steer the car a particular way. You're having to talk on the radio while you're driving, high speeds, the whole deal. And then what happens? You're right back to that same problem where, hey, I don't really understand this, and now all of a sudden, oh, hey, now I feel some, the whole growth thing is about determining where I've got a flaw or a deficit that I want to improve on. And then when I improve on that, I'm constantly being challenged and say, hey, right? So you go through EVOC and normal police driving, and guess what? You go to SWAT, which, I went to SWAT EVOC, and suddenly you realize those rules are off. And then you get up to these tier 1 guys like the Secret Service people and CAG guys and those kind of people. They're driving at a completely different level. So it's a never-ending circle of what the military and law enforcement guys are like an OODA loop, where you're constantly observing. Anyways,
it's a little bit like sword fighting, really.
It's exactly like sword fighting,
because you've got to know what your target is. You've got to know where you're going. First of all, that's a simple, basic thing. Everything you do is one step after another. But like I said earlier, when you get that brain in the reality situation, did everything that you learn work? Was it? Are you able to accomplish it under stress?
Just look at like basic footwork. We use 3 basic footwork, and how long does it actually take people to realize that it's stuff they do every day? It's nothing special. It's nothing weird that we just went home at night and thought up at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah,
it's just.
I have that a lot. It's funny how people will walk and their arms will move with them, but the minute you put something else like a stick or something, they believe that the top part of their body moves independently from their feet.
Yeah.
It's just so odd in a sense, but eventually you get to hopefully put those two together.
Yeah.
It's much the same as holding a sword. I mean, a lot of the time, when you're just holding a sword, it's really simple. It's a simple thing. You got to put it in your hand, but not necessarily, because sometimes people grip it too tight. Sometimes people go from the top part of the sword rather than the base.
That's right.
It's exactly the same thing.
Oh, no, absolutely.
And those are the basics. And then you have to make sure those basics get ingrained in you enough so that you are adding to each level as you move forward.
What's funny a lot is when you get to a certain level of confidence and competence in training, sometimes all it takes is just one little minor thing to totally throw you out where the buses don't run. So yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, you also so let's talk about this. We talked about growth, the point of going from all these basics, from the basics of hand coordination, of footwork, of timing, etc. Once you do that, then you've got to then put it together with somebody in a semi-real.
I think you know what you're talking about. With if you don't have all the fundamentals in place, you'll never be able to progress to the next level of learning and understanding and growing by now working with a partner.
Martial system has a 2-man set. There's different, and they all work on the same thing: targeting, movement, footwork, etc. And eventually you get quicker to do it. Now, what we're looking at right now is a 2-man set, a Japanese 2-man set, and it teaches you the quick changes from 1 minute to the next. It moves on to the European flair, and you can see they're using wooden swords in this particular set, and later on they will be using real weapons. But it is still choreographed. Now, when we do choreography, a lot of the time it is still dangerous, because one small slip, or when you get that adrenaline, we talked earlier on about that being in that moment. That adrenaline is also in that moment because your brain is under stress at that particular time. In this last clip that I'm looking at here, we're looking at a German longsword, and that again is teaching you the technique. How all these techniques are very, very similar, but as well as every single martial art. Here I have Mark Makita, a friend of mine who actually worked with me a lot on the sword experience, and you can see how quick he is, and he's doing it slowly now. Right. So the point is that every single martial art has a 2-man set, and each one is growing from one piece to the next, to the next, to the next. And the people that make it look easy have done it so often that it seems easy, but it's really not. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, we make the mistake, I think, sometimes of calling it advanced. They're doing advanced technique But when you sit down and talk to the master instructors, they'll tell you they're not doing advanced technique. They're just doing basic stuff, but they're doing it at a super high level.
But there's also the fact that everybody here is probably looking at this going, oh my gosh, I've got to do this, then I've got to do that, then I've got to. Well, yes, there is a lot of training that you have to do to reach a certain level, to do it on screen, to do it in reality, to do it either. You still have to develop a certain amount of talent. I'm showing you somebody right now, which is Priscilla. First couple of scenes you're watching right now are the very first time. If you look at the way she's holding the sword here and pushing here, kind of unsure, and yet here she's going really, pretty advanced. So you can see the difference here, where she's developed that talent, but that was not a natural talent. It takes a lot of work. She's developed, but she's still growing, and I think that's something that is necessary to understand, because people like this next gentleman that I want to talk about, Monsieur Bruce Lee, had natural talent. This man, he worked very hard, but you could see this natural talent. The same thing as you talk about, Anakin Skywalker had natural talent when he was doing
the fantasy example versus the versus the Bruce Lee example. But what we forget sometimes, Adrian, is where they actually came from. If you look at the actors, or the actor, it's Christensen. Look at the amount of training that they had to do and go through. What was it, 40? They were doing like 18, 20-hour days for weeks just to get the choreography down. And Bruce Lee, a lot of people don't really realize, he trained for years and years and years before he ever came into the spotlight. But the
thing is also, you mentioned this though, but it takes a lot of time to do it. But somebody with natural talent needs to do that work as well, because somebody with natural talent can be above somebody that doesn't have that talent, but the person that doesn't have the talent who works for it will eventually catch that person up.
It's the never ending race. Suzuki used to say that the student's job was to try to catch him, technique wise. Yeah.
What about we've talked about one movie here. Let's talk about a few others, because there's also a lot of movies that I've seen that have great characters. I'm going to start here with Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones has a couple of really interesting characters that went through growth. And that's a writer's thing. You watch that when you're watching movies, you actually see people grow, although you don't really understand it. Most of the time in a script or in a movie, you have a couple of different things that happen. Either a character grows and changes throughout the script, and that's
right.
The script, that's the scene, that's the development of that growth in a picture. Or that character stays the same, and the ancillary characters around them that they meet and touch and interact with change. And that's so there's two ways of doing it. In Game of Thrones, I'm showing you a picture here of Arya Stark. She started off as a very small, young thing here, and I find it interesting that in this picture that we have here, she has her needle. Eventually becomes her sword, and she becomes very proficient with it. But you can see here, she was just a little baby. Just a little baby. She turned from like this cute little baby thing to 5 years later, after I'm sure training a lot with it, she turns into this very strong character. And I'm going to just let you watch this now, because this video that is here basically shows her growth. It's her from being, this young girl to actually becoming this ruthless killer and very expert swordsman that she becomes, and even eventually killing the person that manipulated most of the things, including her father's death. Actually, Richard, I wanted to bring you in on this one now about the growth. Didn't you dealt with the Hobbits as well? That was another movie that actually had
when you look at the beginnings of that, you have two different. The Hobbit, you have of course Bilbo and his adventure, but it wasn't something he wanted to do. He was what were hobbits? They were just people that lived in the ground. They were normal people like you and I. They weren't heroes. They weren't warriors. And only by enticing him to an adventure did he get out, and was forced by the things that he engaged in that adventure to grow past and actually find his courage, find his bravery. And later on, you've got Frodo, I think it's his nephew, enters on a very similar journey where he goes out with his band of friends, mm-hmm. and they go on this grand adventure, and all of them are just normal people. I mean, they are not warriors, they're not brave, they're actually pretty frightened, and over time, of the different characters and different people that they interact with cause growth inside of them. Some of that growth was intentional, and they wanted that growth. And then some of that growth was not stuff that they, were looking forward to.
But isn't that growth in everything, really? You don't know that you're growing a lot of the time, because the journey that you put yourself on during life is a journey that you are experiencing things that come to you, and if you learn from them, I think one of
the things that Tolkien touched on that made an impact on me, a lot of people missed it, was kind of the growth that you go through. You're never the same after it. You never go back to just being ordinary. The hobbits they didn't go back to being ordinary. They were never quite the same. People that return from war, they're never quite the same. And I think that's what Tolkien was touching base on when he was writing these characters.
That journey you're talking about also happened again in Game of Thrones with Daenerys Stormborn. Daenerys was, this young girl who started her journey trying to recapture something that was taken away from her family many moons ago, and the wrongs that her family had done. Her father was the Mad King. So she was this young, not so certain girl who turns into the queen, and this queen. But then she turned from the queen in being able to command people to being, at the very end, she then became this vengeful-seeking monarch who you could see, if she was let go any further, would possibly end up being like her father was. And obviously the dragons that she had, those famous, that's what gave her more power. And I think sometimes that happens with people as they get more power around them. They change, they grow in one way or another.
Right. Well, look at what we were talking about Anakin earlier. Look at his journey. Just a very simple, goofy thing that occurs where he has a mentor which can help him and guide him on his growth, and his journey gets taken away from him when Qui-Gon basically dies. And what happens? He suddenly becomes, lost. And it takes a while for him to get back. So
yeah, I've just got this. I'm playing at the moment behind me the thing about Daenerys. You can kind of see it in the actresses. I think it's also, as an actor, you develop that as you go through a series. If you're doing something as long as they did on Game of Thrones or we did on Highlander, what ends up happening is you start to understand the character better, and you grow with the character as well as you do it. Anyway, we're running out of time this week. We've run out of time again. I hate to bring that to you, but this week we're out. We wanted to touch on growth and development this week.
But we only started.
I know. That's the thing. I know we just started, but
Well, don't forget the VVVI program, man. We've got that going, right? We had our first event over in Tampa.
That's right. Yeah, the Portsmouth event, and again, we grew out of that, having seen some of the things that people did and wanted, and how that particular program can change. Even though we set it, we create the basics for it, we find things that, we might want to add this or take this away. This was too long, this was too short. And that's where that program grows as well, and it develops.
That's right.
Anyway, listen, thank you for joining us this week. I'm Adrian Paul. We're going to continue this next week on growth, on other elements of growth. So join us next week. We'll be here, and we're going to bring you a few more tidbits from the world of action and reality.